mean, a lot of people will compare software development sometimes to building like a house. You can have those blueprints, you can have everything.
Yeah, but you're going to change your mind a little bit along the way, and that can be okay.
Right. Yes, and that's totally fine. And I think people need to understand that.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Advancing Success podcast, where we help businesses like yours become more successful. My name is Joe Sandine. I am the president and CEO of Onsharp. We're a consulting firm that has been in business for about 24 years. In our last episode, we spent some time talking with Andrew, who leads our discovery process. So if you're not familiar with discovery, that's kind of that initial architecture that we do, where we will sit down with a customer, help them really plan out what are your goals and objectives, what do we need to build. We kind of build the blueprint, come up with all the different technology specifications, and get them to a point where they can make a decision as to whether they want to proceed, and they know full well with all the details what that solution is going to look like. So today we're going to continue that process. I'm here with Dave, who's one of our project managers, and Dave and I are going to discuss and try to give a little bit of insight into what does development look like. I think a lot of businesses don't really understand, or they feel like that development process is maybe kind of a black hole. And so it may come off as, a little bit scary. I don't know what I'm getting myself into. I'm not sure what this all entails. How do I know that we're going to come out of this project with, what we were saying we were going to build? So Dave, thanks for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So obviously the client has spent a lot of time with us in discovery, articulating all their business goals. We've put together a lot of documentation on how we're going to deliver on those goals, what the solution is going to look like. Now transition the project to the operations team and building this out. What does the beginning of the process look like to the client? Do you have a kickoff meeting? Like, how do you kind of like go from discovery into development and just confirm that, okay, we're from our development team's perspective, we're fully on the same page. We don't have any more questions. We're ready to kind of get rolling on this thing.
Yeah, we do have a formal kickoff as more of an introduction to who are the players, or the people, the stakeholders from the client side, what they all want to be involved in when it comes to development. Some clients prefer to be fairly hands-off and want just a weekly report on how things are going. Some clients want to be a little bit more hands-on, and we can kind of customize that a little bit depending, on the actual project, how that aligns with being super involved. Or we typically have a weekly status report meeting that we have with primary stakeholders from our clients, and then an every other week demonstration. And those demonstrations are really to give our development folks an opportunity to show this is what we accomplished these last 2 weeks. And then again, receive feedback from the client during those demos that they can say, this is exactly what we were thinking. This is following the requirements that were outlined in the discovery the way that we intended, or we need to maybe look at some opportunities for change requests.
So who do you normally involve from the client side in a project? How many people might be involved? What are some of the roles that the client plays in the development project? Obviously, we have project management, we have developers, we have testers, UI people. Who does the client normally bring to the table? Who do you recommend they have at the table in the development phase?
Good question. We generally like to have at least one point person who's responsible from the client side for figuring out who should all be involved with a variety of ceremonies. That could be, again, the every other week progress demo. I've seen, CEOs of companies. I've seen, anybody who might be benefiting from the product that we're building attend these progress demos. The weekly, progress updates, which are a little bit more informal, a little bit more, let's review some documentation. That often is just maybe the person who is responsible from the client's angle. That could be anybody from an IT director. It could be somebody from marketing. Right now, I'm working with a client who has 3 marketing directors as their primary point people, and they're all very interested because it all affects each of them differently once the product is complete. So we're very flexible with who wants to be a part of that from the client's perspective.
I like to break down terminology a lot of times because we like to throw in a lot of techie terms that maybe the client doesn't understand. In our last episode, we kind of broke down what MVP stood for. A term we use a lot is called sprints around here. So we do work in sprints. Can you kind of explain to our listeners, what is a sprint? How do you determine how long a sprint is? Even talking about like what we mean when we say a backlog, and how do we use sprints to move our way through development and get to the finish line?
Yeah, we typically operate on what we call a 2-week sprint, which is really just a time-boxed moment in time. We're saying for the next 2 weeks, this is called a sprint. We set out to accomplish the following tasks, which are, again, based on that discovery document. And depending on how many tasks or how many features we are developing, I've seen projects be as little as a couple sprints. I've seen projects be multiple, teens worth of sprints. So we can get up there pretty high depending on the level of effort. And we have a backlog, to your point. A backlog is just a list of here are all the features that are going to be being built with the project. And we pull those into the sprints when we do a sprint planning session. And we do those every other week with the development team, where they say, okay, based on what we have left to do in this project, this is what we're going to pull into this next sprint and actually work on. Sometimes that can be laid out really clearly up front, but oftentimes the way that sprints are designed is for us to be a little bit more flexible, what is called agile, so that we can be moving certain features in and out of the plan and not necessarily laying it all out at the outset. We may have to be a little bit more flexible as development starts to figure out some of the details as they get into the builds, which aren't always clear at the outset. And once you get further into it, they become a lot more clear and a lot more concise.
So how far in advance do you feel like you can normally plan the sprints versus in the moment deciding, okay, the next sprint's coming up, let's do X, Y, and Z? I'm curious how easy it is to plan that versus having to kind of meander your way through it because things kind of change throughout the course of the week.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's a pretty frequent and common thing to see is you have a project plan at the start. There's always going to be a preliminary plan in which we have sprints laid out. We say this is kind of our the plan. It's laid out, but as we go, we definitely find that changes occur when it comes to the plan. We find certain things need to be done before other things can be done that we maybe didn't see at the outset. So we make changes pretty frequently, and we communicate that pretty frequently to the client as well, so they understand that, hey, we had to make a change to the project plan during our weekly status reports. That's a pretty common piece of those weekly status reports to make sure that they are informed as soon as possible if there are any changes for whatever reason.
So I have to imagine that in almost every project that we do or that any company might even do internally, you're going to have opportunities throughout, or I shouldn't say opportunities, you're going to have moments throughout the project where someone's going to try to add scope, try to change the way things are done. And I guess I'm primarily thinking of adding more to-dos to the project. How do you manage that from our perspective? And then what advice would you give to a business who's maybe trying to build something custom and manage scope creep and try to get the first version out the door so that they don't feel like they get stuck in development forever?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier our discovery process is very much in line with an MVP philosophy, minimum viable product. We want to have the version 1 actually producing something that's beneficial to the business, get that out the door and up and running so that businesses can start to see the return on that investment. But we also take into consideration suggestions that come in during the development process that might not be essential to see that return, but could be very beneficial in a future version. And so we create a backlog typically for any suggestions. And again, the client is going to determine, are they important enough to be included in the MVP? They will usually talk internally. We have a robust change management process that requires them to have a document that says, if you want to make a change, the following people need to be informed from the company or the client. And those people need to have the following pieces of information to make a decision on if they want to add something to the MVP. So we again, try to keep that very clearly in the hands of the customer so that they can make those decisions and understand what might be an increase in either timeline, or it might be an increase in budget, or both. Usually, and I'll tell you right now, changes happen with every project. I mean, I don't think I've ever been on a project. I've been doing this for 25 years. I don't think there's ever been a project that has been, documented from start to finish entirely with zero change. There's always something that probably does need to change. That's going to make the product obviously perform the best it can for the end result and for the change.
So I'm assuming that in most projects, there's probably a certain amount of, I'm going to call it plumbing, that has to get done to maybe do some of the things that aren't visually, you're going to see right away, but it's some of the back-end architecture, maybe setting up database stuff, setting up models and things that are going to be used as far as in software development. At what point in a project do you normally start to get to that tangible, as a client, I can visually look at what you're building and I can actually start testing maybe some of the end features that are getting put together?
That's a really good point, because usually we try to be very clear when that moment will show up in the project, because we don't want to be going to a demonstration a couple weeks in and all we've been working on as a development team are the database needs or any of the infrastructure needs that are being set up behind the scenes. So I would say when you get to kind of your second sprint is a typical space in which you start to see some of the tangibles, some of the UI, the user interface.
Okay, so potentially fairly early in the project process, you would actually, as a client, start to be able to see what's bubbling up to the surface.
Yeah, and when we finally have those kind of in place, we do like to have a test plan as well that aligns with those, so that we may be done with a certain page on somebody's website, and we have a test plan that says, hey, we have completed the following features, and you are now eligible to go in and start testing that particular page out. And that helps us get everything signed off on throughout the project rather than have everything pile up at the end of the project. We'd prefer to do it that way versus, again, having everything land on the plate of somebody who's usually very busy at a client throughout the year, and then they have to start testing massively the new website.
So that's a great segue. I think the whole topic of testing, I think as a client, can be a very mysterious thing in terms of what am I expected to test? What are you testing internally? Can you give me a little insight into the different types of testing? I know there's terms like end user testing versus some of the other names we have for the internal testing that we do. I think a lot of businesses don't really understand what testing means. And so I think it'd be a good opportunity to clarify what we normally expect from a client.
Yeah, we usually go into a project with a little bit of a sense of what our quality plan might look like. It's usually sometimes called quality assurance, and that's the internal testing that our team might do as we're building the project. They're going to have the statement of work, which usually has the features really well outlined and spelled out that the discovery team put together. And their job is to go in, build the feature, and then ultimately make sure that feature is exactly matching what is being asked of in the user story. The other side to that is our team often will implement automated testing. So there could be something that could be built alongside the feature, within the feature, that's going to check periodically if the feature is working as intended without anybody touching it. There's going to be some type of a report or notification or an alert generated. When we get to the space where the client is actually testing, they're again kind of asked to look at what is the definition of the feature and does the feature that was delivered actually follow the definition. That's kind of we could call it in terminology smoke testing. I mean, you're there to make sure that everything is on the surface, not on fire, so to speak. But they're ultimately looking to see, is this matching what was ordered? And then that gives them an opportunity again to say, what was ordered, like exactly what we were looking for? Or is there a small tweak that we need to maybe ask about or figure out how to make sure that it's going to actually meet the business need or the outcome that they were hoping for when they implemented it?
Let me ask you, I think the question that a lot of times a client would maybe ask from that testing perspective is, because I think sometimes a client might, find a bug very quickly in their testing, right? And their first question might be, well, why didn't you guys catch that? Can you help maybe answer that as far as like the difference between maybe what kind of testing a developer is going to do versus what you're going to find more as an end user, and how a person that's maybe not in the business might not find it so obvious to find some of those bugs as where the customer, the end user, might notice something is off.
Yeah, and that's a frequent. Ideally, we don't want that to happen at all. I mean, we want to make sure that when we pass off the feature set or the milestone or the software to the client, that nothing immediately crashes. So that's a big part of kind of our quality assurance planning internally. But yes, that does sometimes get through to the client, where a client starts to essentially use the software in the way that they, as the subject matter expert of their business, is going to use the software, and that can produce sometimes what I would call like edge case errors, or not the happy path. And the happy path, just to describe that again for terminology, is, hey, if the story says this is what the feature is going to do, we are only going to test from point A to point B to make sure that that feature is operating the way it was intended. But rather, there could be multiple ways that when you have an end user interacting with that feature, especially when they're used to and familiar with their business functionality, like that could result in things not working entirely the way that they want it to.
I think that's a great point, because I think what we as business people don't realize sometimes is that our end users in the business have found different workarounds or different paths that they take where the software maybe wasn't necessarily built to use it that way, but they've found, again, workarounds or solutions to the way they want to achieve an end result that, sometimes when you're moving from an old system to a new one and you redesign it, now those workarounds are gone because no one ever documented the fact that someone needed to use it that way. Do you run into that a lot, and how do you handle that?
Yeah, it's kind of a change, when everybody kind of reacts certain ways to change. And so if they're used to a certain process or a procedure in their company, you can still build a piece of software that achieves the outcome that they want, that achieves the goal, but it might not be the exact process that they used in the past. And that definitely is something that we talk a lot with our clients about, of making sure that focus is on, are you achieving the result that you want? And does it mimic maybe the result that you would have achieved on the old piece of software? It doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna take the exact same path from point A to point B. It could be a whole different path, but the end result, the way that our team implemented it, which is usually within, keeping in mind they want to be stewards of our clients', budgets, and they want to achieve the result with, maximum efficiency. That it just could be a different way of generating a report or generating a piece of data that's integral to the company's inner workings.
So we talk about the iron triangle of scope, budget, and timeline, right? What do most clients care the most about? Which one normally takes precedent? And maybe there isn't a normal, but I'm just curious what one normally matters the most.
Usually it's budget. I think that's, I think a lot of it's just general nature to say, I want to have an understanding of how much am I going to be spending on this particular project. So but they also understand too, a lot of them will say, well, I just want to make sure that at the end result, it's actually delivering what we set out to make deliver. And if that means there needs to be adjustments to allow that to happen, they're okay with making those adjustments.
So how do you keep a client in the know on where we're sitting at any moment in the project when it comes to timeline, budget, and scope, and whether we are on track or not, so that obviously a conversation can be had to get the project back to where it needs to be?
Yeah, we keep track of a project plan which has a timeline that has our preliminary sprints outlined, an understanding of what we're building in each sprint, and then we can give them pretty robust reporting on what if we've actually achieved the estimate, or if we ran into complications or something changed. That is all being reported, on a weekly basis at a minimum. Again, some clients look for even more reporting. They want to make sure that they have a more hands-on approach that involves additional reporting, additional understanding of how things are being met when it comes to timeline or scope, to your point, the iron triangle expectations. So just frequent communication and having a good communication plan is kind of how we've been able to be successful from that angle.
So for those who are listening and watching this conversation they're maybe in a situation where they're having to make a decision between I'm going to pick up something off the shelf and try to customize it, or I'm going to go the custom route and I'm just going to build something out. If they make the decision to go the custom route, what would the one piece of advice you would give them be to make sure that that project is successful and that they're happy when the project is over?
The big piece of advice that I see is be flexible. I think nobody wants to just lock into a defined project right out of the gate, and if it doesn't produce what you need it to produce as you're seeing it being built, you want to be able to have that flexibility to make changes. A lot of people will compare software development sometimes to building like a house. You can have those blueprints, you can have everything.
Yeah, but you're going to change your mind a little bit along the way, and that can be okay.
Right. Yes, and that's totally fine. And I think people need to understand that. And there's gives and takes too. If you build, you're building your house, you might say, well, I really want this particular feature over here, but in order to get that, I need to stay within my budget, which means this feature over here might have to take a back seat. And to have that flexibility, I would just advise people to go in with an open mind on understanding that it might not be completely just picture perfect out of the box, and you are going to run into some needs to make some changes along the way.
Well, thank you for your time today. That was very insightful. For those listening, hopefully we've been able to give you a little bit of inside scoop into what the development process looks like here at Onsharp, and to maybe help you in your own development process for whatever projects you might be working on. Again, if you need more help or have questions, feel free to contact us. Visit us at onsharp.com. We're more than happy to help you out. And until our next episode, we hope that you see a lot of success in your business. Thank you.